All right, friends, we're here for another installment of our evening Bible study. We're working our way through the life of King David. We've made a lot of progress. We started out with David's great-grandmother Ruth and his great-great-grandmother Naomi, and have tracked his family. We really picked up a lot with David when he was anointed by Samuel to be the king. We tracked him all the way through, working with Saul, hiding from Saul, reuniting with Saul, hiding from Saul, back and forth, and so we're now in the period of David's life where he has been the king of all 12 tribes of Israel for some time, maybe even as much as 20 years. The last time we were together, we went over chapter 14 and chapter 15 of 2 Samuel, looking at some of the fallout from David's huge, horrible disobedience, rebellion, and sin against God with Bathsheba. The promise that came from God and the prophet Nathan was that there would be consequences for David's actions. He'd be forgiven, but he was going to bear the consequences of this for some time. The sword was never going to pass from his house. He would never fail to have somebody on the throne from his line, but there was always going to be tension and strife and chaos. And so in the last session, we definitely saw that in chapter 14 and 15 as his son Absalom, who was beautiful and smooth and charming and loved, started doing some really horrible things. There were already horrible things going on in David's family between the sons and the daughters of his various wives. That came to a head with the murder of one son by the other son, Absalom. He went in exile. He was brought back to Jerusalem after 5 years. And so now, when we come to chapter 16, we're going to see how things are still sort of unraveling a little bit for David. Somebody last week asked the question about, do we believe that God is still with David at this point? I think God is still with David. I'm not sure how much David is with God. We don't see quite as many instances where he writes songs to God. He breaks out in prayer to the Lord. He's seeking God's instruction. Granted, there's been a shift in the perspective. We're now focusing on all these crazy kids of his, but it's hard to see that David is quite as close to God as we have seen him in the past. And as usually happens when there's some drift from God, everything else kind of falls apart. So let's look at 2 Samuel 16. It's the only chapter we're going to worry about this evening. We'll see how we do. 2 Samuel 16, verse 1. Just by way of one more little quick review. So, Absalom has been currying favor with the people. He has declared himself the king down in Hebron. He is making his way to Jerusalem to take over as the king of all of Israel. His father has heard that news and is taking his entire household out of town. They have left out on the northeast corner. They're heading across the same valley that Jesus went across numerous times. He is hiked up to the top of the Mount of Olives to get out of town, and that is where we find David at the beginning of chapter 16. Okay? When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on. The bread and fruit are for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the wilderness. We'll pause there for just a second. So David and all of his family, all of his bodyguard, all of his special attendants, the mighty men that we've read about 2 or 3 times, all of these ultimate warriors are with him, traveling with him out of the city, and they come upon a man named Ziba. You remember his name from before? Anybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know why.
It's not a name you would forget. Ziba, we met back about 6 or 7 chapters ago in 2 Samuel 9, 10, and 11. Ziba was the steward of Saul's household. And so David had sought out Ziba to find out if there were any descendants of Saul left so he could take care of them. He could reach out to them, make sure that they were okay, and come to find out there was a son, the son of his best friend, Jonathan, which is what he was looking for. And he brought Mephibosheth, who had been injured as a child, crippled for life. He brought him to Jerusalem, and he ate at the king's table like one of his own children. David had placed Ziba, Saul's servant, over Mephibosheth's household, and so Ziba and all of his children served this former royal family. Okay, so we see Ziba now up on the top of the Mount of Olives, meeting David. I don't know how he knew he was there. Maybe it doesn't matter. But he has brought information and supplies to David as he retreats. So he's got at least a couple of donkeys. It says a string. Hebrew has 2. It's a short string of donkeys. They are loaded down with raisins and a skin of wine and some cakes of bread and cakes of figs. It doesn't actually say figs. It calls it summer fruit. I don't know what summer fruit is. Summer fruit, summer not. I'm not sure what it is. But
whatever they grew in the summer there.
That's right. It could be watermelons. I have no idea. But they've got all of those there. He's brought all these things, and David says, well, what's all this for? Well, Your Highness, because I knew your family would need these. I wanted to bring these gifts to you in case anybody was feeling faint along the way. When I started reading this chapter, I read it with a great deal of charity towards Ziba, that, oh, what a great guy. He's taking care of this royal family, and now he's taking care of David too. He really is a good dude. And the longer I've read it, the more I think he's a suck-up, and he's trying to make sure that he gets some special favors for the king. Oh, look, I brought all these groceries I knew you would need on the way out. And especially because of what he tells him in the next paragraph. Why have you brought these? Well, it's for you, in case you get tired in the wilderness. And then the king asks, where's your master's grandson? Where's Mephibosheth? Ziba said to him, he is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks, today the Israelites will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom. Maybe. There doesn't seem to be any indication in the text to come that Mephibosheth is doing anything underhanded or sneaky, or that he's trying to take advantage of this major turnover in power in Jerusalem. I believe, because I'm not always charitable to some people, I believe that Ziba is making all this up. He is telling David what he knows David will respond to favorably towards Ziba. Oh, well, the answer is, well, if that's what Mephibosheth thinks, then I now grant you all of his land. It's all yours. I believe it's underhanded. If you'd like to be generous and sweet to Ziba, you certainly can, but I think this is an underhanded deal. I don't believe there's anything actually going on with Mephibosheth, and Ziba is just lying because the king is heading out of town. This seems like the moment to strike while the iron is hot. It is possible that Mephibosheth and Absalom had some kind of connection. Remember, their dads were the best of friends, closer than brothers. I'm assuming that their parents got together and played cards or had barbecue or whatever. Especially after David became the king, it would seem like Mephibosheth is eating at the king's table, where Absalom would have been as well. So maybe there is some kind of cahooting going on there. But again, we don't really have any information about that. It is possible Mephibosheth might actually be guilty of this and believes that his buddy Absalom is going to be gracious to him as he takes over for his father. At any rate, David takes what he had given to Mephibosheth and then hands it off to the servant, Ziba.
Wow.
Everything that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. And then Ziba says, I humbly bow. Usually you don't have to tell people you're being humble. I humbly bow. May I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king. Okay, we'll just take a poll. How many of you feel like Ziba is probably working out of noble intentions, trying to save David in some way? Anybody going to give him the benefit of the doubt? He's a good guy doing a good thing. How many of you have been affected by your pastor? I believe it's underhanded, sneaky, and dirty.
I think David should have got both sides of the story
I'm
before he
gonna
did that.
raise my hand and say my judgment is lousy, so I'm not gonna come down on either.
Well, you know what? The nice thing is that nobody's salvation depends on that position. We don't really know. I think it's a lot easier, especially like with the tone of everything that goes on in these chapters right here. It's all about inner strife in the royal family and all this backstabbing and trying to grab power. It just feels like he's just
like
one
Washington.
more.
Yeah, like nothing's changed.
There's nothing new under the sun, no matter what hemisphere you happen to live in. All right. Well, anybody have any deep thoughts about any of that so far? Questions?
I have a note down here that refers to something further on, so I'm just gonna not go there.
Okay,
Okay.
Susan.
Okay, well, hang on to it.
He read your mind because you would tell him, we're gonna get to that, hold on.
We might need that in a minute.
Okay, well, it's in chapter
So
19.
being a newcomer and not being as versed in this, is David fleeing before Absalom, or is he just giving it over? Well,
He's running.
he's running, yeah. It's like he's afraid.
I believe he is not just, I don't believe he's vacating just so it's an easy transition. I think what we talked about last week for sure is that he realizes that if he stays and fights, that the whole city is going to be embroiled in this sort of, not even really a civil war. It is, but not exactly. It's mostly this family war. And they're all going to pay the price for it. There's going to be thousands of people injured and things are going to be destroyed if David stays to fight. So part of it, I think, is David going back to his good shepherd roots to take care of this sheep. I also think there's probably at least a little bit of fear because Absalom, his major fall from his father's grace was that he had killed his oldest half brother Amnon, who would have been the next king. But Absalom killed him because Amnon raped Absalom's sister and then wanted
Got
nothing
that?
to do with her.
I do, but then, you're kind of divided on, well, yeah, I can understand him killing the half-brother to avenge his.
There's
Is that the
there's
one that
room in the
raped
Old
Tamar?
Testament for vengeance.
Yep,
Amnon is the one that raped.
Okay.
Tamar.
yeah.
Amnon is a bad guy as well.
Oh,
And
wow.
Absalom-
There's a lot of bad
Absalom-
stuff going on.
Absalom got revenge, which may or may not have been the right move. David didn't really respond. All he did was get angry. There's no punishment. There's no consequences. We see no information that David, as the king or as the dad of all these people, said, hey, this is not the way we behave here. You need to repent. Actually, according to the law, I should take you out and stone you for what you did to your... I think there's a little fear and trembling because Absalom is an opportunist and a snake oil salesman, and he is going to slide his greasy self right into the throne. And it is not beyond him to kill somebody to get what he wants.
And he's greased people too.
Oh, absolutely. He has created favor every place he's been.
And he goes out and
he's
says,
slick.
I'm the new king. He's not going to get a lot of opposition.
Well, I have a question that just popped in my mind. Do we have any idea how many kids David had? King David?
A few.
I mean, any, because
Because
that would explain why he didn't get too involved in discipline.
Did I-
because-
You might not have known.
Because I've seen with my polygamous side of the family, they have so many kids, it's the man it's the wife raises the kids. So,
Okay, so
yeah.
we had this one earlier. You probably have it someplace, but this is just a really simplified picture of David's family, the women that he married, and their children.
But what about
This
the
is not
concubine?
this is not exhaustive. There's lots of kids.
Prolific comes to mind.
He
That's
is
what I-
he is
yeah.
not as bad as
He
his
doesn't
son
have
Solomon
time.
will be, but he did a lot of dumb things. I've been listening to my Bible reading. I've actually been doing just Bible listening this year, and I've just come through the part where where God gives the instruction to Israel that if you pick a king, the king needs to be somebody who's not going to get drawn away by many wives. Because these foreign wives will draw him away. It's like, okay, David, you got so many things right, but wow, you really messed this part up. Solomon really messed this part up. So
He really wouldn't have had time to get that involved with, he probably had hundreds of kids.
well, I'll go with maybe
Counting the ones that
maybe dozens.
concubines.
Like I said, he was not as prolific as his son Solomon, who had, I never get the order right, 700 wives and 300 concubines, or
Oh,
the other way
okay,
around. That's way too many.
good for him.
No, not good for anybody. All right, let's look at verse 5.
Sorry.
Did we draw a circle around all that?
Yeah.
All right, okay. All right. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard, the mighty men, were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer.
That's pretty
Okay? Insult to injury. He's had to run from the palace, take all of his family with him, and now there are hecklers and protesters along the side of the road as they're making their way, calling names, telling them to get out, leave, you dirty, low down, rotten. Get out, get out, get out, go. The man who's doing all this hollering and screaming is a relative of King Saul. He is from the tribe of Benjamin, just like Saul was. His family is actually a little even closer. They're closer cousins. And clearly, Shimei believes that David had a hand in some horrible, scandalous, murderous things concerning concerning Saul's family. So David, his wives, his children, some of his concubines, his bodyguard, the Kerethites and the Pelethites, which we've talked about before, and these mighty men, they've got him surrounded, the secret services on all sides, taking him down the road, and here comes Shimei chucking rocks. Well, Ernest T. Bass action for, any Griffith people. And he's calling him names. He's a murderer and a scoundrel. Literally, he says, you are a man of blood and you are a worthless good for nothing. Not necessarily very high praise. And he says that God has given the kingdom out of David's hand into Absalom's hands because David is guilty of bloodshed. He's guilty of murder, specifically having to do with the death of Saul's family. Then our old buddy Abishai shows up. Abishai, who is a nephew of David and one of the military leaders. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, what does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? That sounds like a son of Zeruiah. If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and all his officials, my son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjamin? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. Okay? So Ernest is chucking rocks and calling names, running him out on a rail. Abishai, the military guy, says to Uncle Dave, we can't let this happen. Who does this dead dog think he is? Dogs are not pets. Dogs are feral animals in this time in the world. That wasn't a cute puppy. This is a vicious, unclean animal, and he calls him a dead dog, which means he's double unclean. That's like the best slam you can give to somebody who was a Jew during that time. You're a dead dog. Unless maybe you call him a dead pig. That would be worse. But, Abishai has no love for this man. Abishai wants him silenced. I will go kill him. You say the word. Please say the word. And that is not how David responds. David sadly understood that this harassment, this lambasting that he's receiving is well deserved. He was guilty. Maybe not of any bloodshed with Saul's family, but he was guilty of bloodshed. He had Uriah killed. And so perhaps, David says, perhaps the Lord is using Shimei to humble David, to bring him to some repentance. And he says there should be no punishment for this man who may very well be speaking because God has directed him to. And so, scream on. Thanks for being here. And it just goes on and on and on for apparently like the rest of the day. As David and all of that entourage makes their way down the road, Shimei is right there, blasting them, harassing them, haranguing them, chucking rocks and dirt and insults.
Just by himself? He's just by himself?
Well, the NIV kind of says that it's by himself, but some place where I was reading, it indicated that there were other people who kind of joined in.
Yeah, I would bet there probably were.
And it says at the end of that passage that when they got to wherever they were headed, they were all exhausted. Well, you might expect that. Being called everything but a child of God all day long does tend to wear you out. Plus dodging dirt clods and big rocks. That's a very humiliating way to leave your capital.
NIS doesn't suggest that there's anybody but Shimei.
Oh, really? Okay.
I can't remember where
How do we know?
I picked that up.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to say.
Well, it doesn't really say one way or the other.
Right.
It just calls out Shimei and that's it. This is my version.
Yeah, he's the only one that's mentioned.
Right.
I do, again, in the movie in my head, that's quite a little scene. All these guys in their camo gear, their intercoms in their ears and their microphones in their sleeves, all protecting the king, holding up one arm to shield him from the rocks that are coming from this sort of unbalanced dude.
Ernest T. Bass is the perfect
Mhm.
reference. I can just see him knocking a rock, hiding behind a bush.
That down pat.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
I
Ernest
just dated
T.
myself.
That was a good show. I wonder why I never watched it before.
All right.
I'm sure it's syndicated somewhere.
So,
Oh, it's out there.
David, all of his family, they're out of the royal city. They're being pelted and humiliated as they go, driven out by supporters of the previous administration. And that leaves this big vacuum in Jerusalem. That brings us to verse 15. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with them. I guess I should have handled this one other thing first. Pause that. Okay, so my question was, Shimei makes this accusation that David is guilty of the blood of Saul's family. We've been through all that.
He really wasn't, was he?
To the best of my recollection, and going through all my notes and searching for stuff any way I knew how, David didn't kill any of Saul's family.
No.
Saul was always after David.
Yeah.
And had his men after David.
Yeah.
Best friends with Jonathan. Mm-hmm.
Did he
Oh,
really
yeah.
actually kill any of Saul's family? Well, there's maybe 3 reasons why Shimei believes that he's guilty. Okay, first, there was this ongoing clash between the house of Saul and the house of David. not of David's doing. It was all Saul's fight. David wasn't fighting Saul. Saul was fighting David. Okay, we saw that for chapters and chapters back early on in 2 Samuel. Okay, so there is that. Maybe just like you're guilty of bloodshed because this all took place. It is possible, a second thing, that David may have been seen as being complicit in the death of Saul's general Abner, that Joab killed, and Saul's son Ishbosheth, which some other supporters of David killed. Okay, remember that?
Yeah.
Joab, David's nephew, the commander of the Israeli army, lured Joab in and had him killed because Abner had killed fairly in battle Joab's brother.
So he's probably blaming him based on those things.
Maybe he just feels like, well, he was the leader of those
Behind
people,
it or
so he must have been behind it. He must have made him do it. But when we see, after the death of both Abner and Ishbosheth, David was deeply affected. He was genuinely sorrowful. He declared like a state of mourning for everybody in the nation when Abner died, and when Ishbosheth was killed by these supporters of David's. As soon as they declared, "Hey, guess what we did, David? We killed your enemy." He had them killed on the spot.
Yeah.
So maybe he thinks that there's something underhanded going on there. There is one other deal that we won't read about for a few more chapters in chapter 21, but at some point David works out a deal with some people from Gibeon. They had been injured in some way by Saul and his family, and so they wanted to make it right. They wanted revenge. So we'll see in chapter 21 that David said, well, these are the only descendants of Saul left, and so they take 7 descendants of Saul, male descendants, and kill them. Maybe this is a little out of chronological order and he's mad about that. But in any of those circumstances, David's not really guilty of killing anybody in Saul's family. He was best friends with Jonathan. He married the daughter Michal. He has taken care of Mephibosheth by seeking him out intentionally to bring him to Jerusalem, to make him a part of his own home, to feed him at his table, to provide for him in every way. So I think Shimei is all up in the night about this stuff. I think he's way, way wrong. I don't think David should be considered guilty of anything other than not slapping Joab and Abishai around as much as he should have. All right, now verse 15. Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel, the priest, was with him, or sort of priest. Then Hushai the Archite, David's confidant, went to Absalom and said to him, "Long live the king, long live the king." Absalom said to Hushai, "So this is the love you show your friend. If he's your friend," his David, "why didn't you go with him?" Hushai said to Absalom, "No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the son, just as I served your father, so I will serve you." Okay. Last time we're together, Hushai wanted to go with David, and David said, "Nope. You can actually be a lot more valuable if you will stay in Jerusalem, if you will get close to Absalom, stay there beside him, and either feed information back to me or take all of the advice that he gets, especially from Ahithophel, and just mess it up. Question question everything. So Hushai does that. He goes. We see here that he tells Absalom, "I'm here to serve. I promise I'm gonna serve you only." Are you sure? Well, you are my father's advisor. Why don't you go with him? Oh no, Absalom, you are too great. The Lord has chosen you. The people have chosen you, and so it would be foolish for me to go anywhere else. I serve the Father, I will certainly serve the Son. And for an egomaniac, it's just pat, 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 pat. He's winning friends and influencing people. So now Hushai is in a position where from this point on, all he has to do is throw verbal hand grenades. Every time Ahithophel gives some advice to King Absalom, well, but what about this? Well, had you considered this? Just always questioning and questioning and questioning. Okay. And it's interesting that Absalom places a very high value on the advice that he gets from Ahithophel. Ahithophel had served David, now he's serving Absalom, and the text tells us that Absalom believed that a word from Ahithophel was as good as a word from God himself. Like this man could do no wrong. Clearly, the advice that he's about to get from Ahithophel is not advice that comes from God. Absalom says to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What shall we do? What do we do now? We've made it to Jerusalem. What do we do?" Verse 21, Ahithophel answered, "Sleep with your father's concubines whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he slept with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now in those days the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. So, young buck Absalom and all of his people have made their way into Jerusalem. There's no resistance. People spread the waters for him. He just marches right in all the way to the palace, sits down on the king's throne and says, "Okay, Ahithophel, what do we do now?" And what's the advice? Well, your father left these concubines here, these 10 ladies. I believe you need to mark your territory. So go sleep with all of them. I forget which translation it is, but it doesn't have obnoxious. It has you will make yourself odious.
Mine says odious.
Odious. That's the more literal thing. Do you know what odious means? Anybody?
Not literally, but
10-year-old boys, odious. School buses in August after PE, odious.
Oh, stinky, odorous.
odious and odorous.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is about a horrible stink, a nasty, horrible stench, like a rotting corpse kind of stench. Ahithophel pushes Absalom to conquer his father's concubines because, again, I will always look for the dirty, underhanded self-servingness in people, especially in David's life. He is trying to make sure that he stays in control. David had a great deal of respect for Ahithophel's advice. Absalom clearly has a great deal of respect. He kind of has Absalom where he wants him. He's the main counselor for the king. He's really calling all the shots. And so if he tells Absalom, you do this thing that is so heinous that your father will never be able to forgive you, there is no chance for reconciliation. There will be no forgiveness. I see that pretty easily in this move, because it doesn't make a lot of sense otherwise. It's actually against the law. Mosaic law says in Leviticus 20 that if a man has sexual relations with his father's wife, he has dishonored his father. Both the man and the woman are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads.
The woman probably didn't have a choice.
There's also rules about that too. You know, if they're attacked and they're in a place where nobody can come help them, then she can be spared. But if she's in the middle of the town and she doesn't say anything, then she's just as guilty. Takes two to tango, or in this case, 11. So in fulfilling this advice, both Ahithophel and Absalom believe that they are strengthening their position. Look, we're going to come in here and we're taking everything. This is our stuff. This is a brand new day in Jerusalem. It's a brand new administration. We're going to make things better than they've ever been before. The people already believe that he's beautiful and handsome and can do no wrong. And now here is this studly king, you know, doing what studly kings apparently do. Now, I think he's also sort of saying, well, I am the king, and these are the royal concubines, and so they belong to me now. I think he's kind of flexing a little bit for his father to show him he's the king. So they set up a tent on the top of the palace. In Jewish culture, this tent is called the chuppah. It's the little, now it is a little tent that is set up for Jewish weddings that they stand underneath. So that is kind of devolved from this bridal tent where the matches are being made. That's probably a nice way to put that. So on top of the palace roof, in full sight of everybody, anybody around can see that this bridal tent is going up and that Absalom is there in the sight of all Israel. That's
Hopefully inside the tent. Who knows?
well, he believes he's beautiful, so it's hard to say. This advice coming from Ahithophel, go have sex with all of your father's concubines, it is horrible, ungodly, awful advice. It did not come from God. It comes right from Ahithophel's heart. But in doing it, we can kind of hear some echoes from a few chapters ago, back in chapter 12. Remember the line there in chapter 12? This is what the Lord says: out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity on you. Clearly. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight.
Wow.
You did it in secret, but I'll do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. There are consequences for sin. You can be forgiven. There's still consequences for sin.
Yeah. Natural consequences. Yeah.
And that's everything that I have written down for chapter 16. So, as we've been talking, what do you believe is an application? What is an important thing that you and I need to learn about from this account? I don't have a list that I'm checking off. I don't have an answer. I want to know what you think. What should we learn from David and Absalom and this chapter?
Be careful who you get your advice from.
It's all confusing.
Making sure that the people who are giving you counsel are wise,
And righteous.
that they're actually inquiring from God about what they should do. what they
Was
should
he
say.
a righteous man before he told him to do that? We
We
don't really know.
don't know a lot about him other than he
Hmm.
served David and then he served Absalom.
Hmm.
Clearly, this advice has nothing godly about it. Joanne,
The first verse in chapter 17, I question whether Ahithophel could still be loyal to David.
I think he's doing exactly what he was asked to do.
Well, it's
Cause trouble.
shaded. I
Yeah,
don't know.
that's
I
right.
can't
He
tell.
did tell him to stir things up, didn't he?
Hmm.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have read ahead, but it's about the page.
That's okay.
That's often where the answer is.
well, when we get together next week, we'll definitely talk about chapter 17. But again, it kind of seems like, and this is just my understanding of his character from the little bit we read here. It always seems like the best advice for Absalom is usually what is best for Ahithophel's position. You know, he's going to send Absalom after David to get only David. His thousands of men are going to go after him. I don't know. That maybe doesn't seem like the best kind of counsel. I think he's totally shady, totally selfish. I believe he is a bad guy with bad hair and a bad suit and a political movie. It's what I
Yeah,
think.
because he told him to do evil stuff. That was not, it was like illegal, did you say?
Against the law and
Yes.
ungodly.
But who's gonna go after him for doing that illegally?
Yeah, when you're the king, who's going to come after you?
Because they didn't go after David either.
I'm confused.
Okay.
I thought Hushai was supposed to be the one to mess everything up.
He is.
So how is it all of a sudden that it's Ahithophel that's doing it?
Well, Ahithophel is just giving advice. We haven't really seen Hushai saying much so far.
I can't keep them all straight.
I don't even know how you can pronounce them.
Exactly. It's hard when they're names that are so unfamiliar.
Sake is in high.
Well,
Yeah.
we just call them like Larry and Bob and Jack.
Yeah.
Yeah, Hushai came to Absalom and said, "Hey, I used to serve your dad, but I want to serve you because you're the king now." That just makes sense. I love your dad, but I also love you. I want to serve you. You're the one God has chosen. Ahithophel had been David's counselor as well, but he jumped ship a while ago. He ran to Absalom and kind of encouraged this whole political overthrow.
Seems like Absalom is being very naive.
Arrogant.
Someone told
Yeah.
I believe he is beautiful and handsome and popular, but there's
But
not
not
a
very
lot going on
talented.
inside.
Oh, here it is. 1531. Someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness. Why then did it say later on that he took Ahithophel's advice to also be from God?
Because I think initially he did, when before Absalom was a choice, it would seem like Ahithophel was a trusted counselor. But once he decided he was throwing his lot in with Absalom, it's like, oh, well, clearly I've been duped. Lord, here's my prayer. Make his words stupid. Don't let anything smart come out of his mouth.
Yeah.
Make it all disastrous.
I do remember that.
And then he sent Hushai as well to, sort of be God's hammer to make that happen.
And to report back to him what's going on.
Right. Joanne, you have this look. You've had this look for 10 minutes.
I know, it's just crazy, isn't it?
Oh, what's the name? What happened that? Oh, the wicked webs we weave.
Well, first we practice to
I know, the Bible has some of the wickedest people. But,
Yeah, but every time somebody gets punished for it.
yeah,
Are you just gonna?
or natural.
Are you gonna share with the
consequences
class?
What the lesson
For,
was, and the
for
lesson
generation
is,
to generation.
no matter how good a friend you got in his counsel, you don't sleep with your dad's wives. Yes.
What about the concubines?
No matter
Doesn't
no matter how young and cute they are, hands off.
That's true, but Absalom wanted the kingship anyway. He might have done that without the advice later on.
Well, then that's,
But he was
but-
just encouraged.
but
to
then
do
his
it.
advisors wouldn't be guilty of it. You don't,
Well, I realize that.
if.
In the
advisors are
fundamentalist
just
churches,
given really
they
lousy-
intentionally do that. When a prophet dies, they get all their wives. They do that. That's who they go to as the successor, which, like in Warren Jeff's case, it was, his father. When his father died, he got all of his wives. It's kind of like expected.
Sorry, ladies, but I'm still trying to
Yikes.
figure out who on earth would want more than one.
Yeah.
And especially more than one at a time.
It's not a happy life for any of them because they don't get along.
That's why they all have separate houses.
Mhm. Usually, yeah, a lot of times they do nowadays, and if they don't, they're just miserable.
And I'd have a separate house too, and it'd be thousands of miles from.
I have a niece for her.
It wouldn't be a man cave, it'd be a man fortress.
And
Moats, dragons, fire.
I mean, I love
and the other
women,
wife
but come
have
on.
another.
All right, so when we get together next time, we will look at chapter 17, then maybe some more. David's family is messed up. David's control, David's closeness to God, his connection with God are all sort of weakening. There ought to be some lessons there for leaders, dads, husbands, parents. You don't stay close to God. You don't bring your kids up to have the same kind of respect for God. There's potential disaster waiting. So
Be a part of your kids' lives and don't have so many kids that you can't be.
Yeah.
Only have what you can, that's what I get from it.
Well, it's
you want to run man to man, not zone. For
It's
sure.
kind of like everything else. If you have kids and we were talking about earlier, and you don't teach them history, you don't teach them your values, you don't teach them why you even have them, the past and why it happened that way and how it affects now. How do you expect your kids to be able to relate to anything now and in the future? They don't have they have nothing to go back on they don't have a foundation for it. This is no different.
But they have so many kids, they literally don't have time. The wives raise them.
Okay, and so with that, we're gonna turn this off for this session. Don't forget, you can always go back on the YouTube channel. Everything that we've done with David and more is there. If you just get to missing the sound of my voice, so you can revisit any of those things as many times as you want. Thanks. Bye.
I should have waited.